So welcome everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. Thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on Web3. If you are new to ACG Silicon Valley, we are the leading business-to-business networking organization in the Valley, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. ACGSV offers an array of networking opportunities with over 13,000 members in 59 chapters across the world. ACG provides local connections with a global reach. We are excited to start offering face-to-face events again. In March, we will have our public board dinner on the 9th and a networking happy hour at Ludwig's in Mountain View on the 24th. Please register ASAP so we can get a feel for how many people to expect. We are excited. I am. Next Wednesday is our California ACG e-lunch. On March 2nd, we will have our M&A Circle event on International M&A Gotchas. Our first female executive leaders circle featuring Christine Boyden from Cruise, a self-driving car service, will take place on March 3rd. Please join us for that. It's going to be a really, really interesting fireside chat. So just register online. Many more events to follow. So we invite you to visit our website at acgsv.org to see the full calendar of what we have in store for you. Now on to today's panel discussion. I would like to introduce you to our moderator today, Roy Chua, founder and principal at Avid Think, an independent research and advisory service. Roy was also co-founder at SDX Central, where he ran both the research and product teams. Roy was formerly a management consultant working with both Fortune 500 and startup technology companies on go-to-market and product consulting. He has 20 plus years of experience in telco and enterprise cloud computing, networking and security, including founding several Silicon Valley startups. So without further ado, I will hand over the mic to Roy so he can get us started. Roy?
Excellent. Thank you, Yvonne. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Hopefully, we'll make your lunchtime more interesting, unless you're somewhere else in the country, in which case, hopefully we'll make your tea time more interesting or your brunch more interesting. But thank you for joining us today. We're going to have an excellent panel. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists and very quickly have them introduce themselves. They'll do a better job of it than I will. So let's bring on Yuhong Liu from Santa Clara University. Yuhong, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Roy. So my name is Yuhong Liu. I'm currently an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Santa Clara University. And my research interest mainly focuses on the trustworthy computing and cybersecurity. So for the recent few years, I spent quite a lot of time exploring the blockchain-related techniques. So that will also help me share some of my insights today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Yuhong. Next up, let's have Miko. Miko, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm a venture capital investor and general partner with Gumi Cryptos Capital. We deployed $21 million into seed stage opportunities like Celsius Network, OpenSea, Yield Guild Gaming, and a number of unicorns and tridecacorns and various creatures. So we're definitely, I'm here, I think, to represent the Web3 is real perspective. So, you'll hear a lot more from me, I hope, soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Miko. And unfortunately, unicorns are less rare, or fortunately, unicorns are less rare than they used to be. Anyhow. All right. And to round out the panel, we have a good friend, Dan Pitt. Dan, if you could introduce yourself to the audience, please.
Thank you, Roy. Well, good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel discussion here today. I come mostly from the telecom and datacom industries, having had a long career working with telcos and their enterprise customers. I got a great opportunity to sort of oversee the launch of the movement of software-defined networking and SDN. which really, I think, transformed networking into an arm of computing. And so much is done. And I am currently involved very much in MEF, what was the Metro Ethernet Forum. No longer actually working there, but I'm running a project there with some startup companies I work with. And the interesting relevance of that to this topic area is in the provision of automated concatenated services around the world, where a number of the operators have automated access to their customers, and they do real-time automated settlements using distributed ledger technology. And as we're seeing what's happening on the edge, so-called edge of the network, really is where all this, a lot of excitement is going to be happening with new services and 5G low latency applications and things like that. So looking forward to what we have to say here. And I think we're instructed to bring our strong personal biases to this discussion. Is that right, Roy?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you hate Web3, just say it. If you love it, say it too. I think that makes it a lot more interesting. And if you don't know what Web3 is, I don't either, so it's okay. But we're going to kick off with that, actually, speaking of Web3. So we're all here to talk about Web3. So before we can do that, it might be a good idea to try to define this amorphous thing called Web 3.0. What we're going to do is try to get some definition around it, or at the very least talk about some of the components that make up Web3. And to do that, we'll also explore the drivers behind why Web3 is interesting and is something that some of the folks out in the industry are driving to it. So given that, normally ideally you put your money where your mouth is, kind of, right? So we'll start with Miko. Miko, you've put your money into, arguably Web3 type properties. So maybe if you could shed some light around Web3 and why do we need it?
Yeah, so let me frame it a certain way, right? Which is that the term Web3, I think, is sort of immediately a bit suspect because I'm not convinced that there was a Web 2, right? If I think about web from a protocol perspective, like it's not as if Tim Berners-Lee basically, created a new version of the web, right? So the name is kind of dumb. But to me, the thing that is sort of blindingly obvious for me is that a very, very large part of the user experience of the internet is sort of sadly broken, right? And that in a way, when you look at all of the ad-driven internet, like that's a complete sort of wasteland, right? So in a sense, like, it's sort of tragically broken what's happened, right? And I think that, for example, if you want to look at things like cybersecurity, I can go on the dark web today and buy a file with 8 billion name password pairs in it, right? So I can get all of your passwords off the dark web, right? So to me, like, it turns out that the kind of the internet is badly in need of privacy, it's badly in need of cryptography, and it's badly in need of better incentive models, right? So if you want to call that Web3, then by all means, but to me, what's incontrovertible is that we're going to build out a section of the internet based on these principles, and it's going to be better than what we have.
Got it. That's helpful. So Web3 is an attempt to take back the internet, as it were. And the tools that we're going to use to do that are, I'm guessing, some levels of cryptography, distributed communication, distributed computing, some of these elements, right? And so maybe let's dig into some of those elements, and who better to do that than someone who's explored them on a technology level. So Yu-Hong, if you could maybe talk about some of these underlying technology foundations that, we're a technology organization, I guess, after all, we're in the Valley, right? So if you could maybe describe some of these key foundations that enable Web 3.0, or whatever name that's better than 3.0 that Miko eventually will like, if you could maybe do that for the audience, I think that'd be helpful.
Okay, sure. So I think here, I just share my personal opinion. Again, you
Sure.
may or may not agree with me. But in my opinion, I think Web 3.0, I think there are some important properties we may mention. So one of them is the openness. That means anyone from anywhere can join the network, not only as consumers, which is right now we're doing, but they are also actively contributing to the network by not only providing their data, like the Web 2.0, someone believes, but they are also sharing different resources like their computing power, their storage space, their communication capabilities, and so on. So I believe that's the openness things that is kind of unique for Web 3.0. But with that being said, we can see we also try to push the computing and storage more towards the edge of the network rather than what we are doing today, like mostly relying on those giant powerful servers. So with that being said, I think decentralization is another important property. And by bringing those computing and storage close to the user, we can make it more convenient for them. And also users have more control over their data. For example, who can access them and under what type of conditions. Then also, although the computing and storage may happen like on multiple edge devices, we do need a global consensus mechanism so that everyone agrees the current data, the states of the network is consistent. So that's a consensus thing. And the other one is suppose for security purpose, everyone should be able to validate the data or the states of the network. So that's what I consider as the open validation thing. So those are the properties. Then in order to enable those properties, there are quite a few promising techniques that are ongoing. I may just point out a few of them. I may miss some of them. So let's start. I think the first one, which is also the one I focus on, is the blockchain technique. So back to the early stage, Bitcoin and digital currency, I think was the first time capture a wide attention from the general public regarding the blockchain technologies. But back then, the application of blockchain was kind of very narrow. Then with the Ethereum, they try to consider the blockchain system more like a state machine. They kind of generalize that. So the system may transit from one state to another. And then those transactions, what we used to refer to as those financial transactions, are also generalized. They can represent the interactions among different parties who actually participate in the network. And those transactions will actually eventually lead to the state transitions of the network. So that's how they make it general. And because of that, blockchain nowadays is more, could actually serve as a computing infrastructure that can support diverse applications on top of it. For example, the distributed finance, DeFi, or blockchain-based games. And blockchain can also help like supply chain, healthcare, all those different diverse applications that are enabled. So that's how I treat or consider blockchain as an essential technique. And then on top of that, smart contracts were actually born. Those are eventually just some pieces of code that can be deployed on blockchain, and they can implement complex logic. So certain actions can be automatically executed when only conditions are met. So with that being said, then blockchain could also be more open to potential other applications. And also those smart contracts are written in a open source, so everyone can validate the correctness. And that also ensures the trust among different parties. So that, for example, no party can leave the smart contract by taking advantage of other parties. So that's an important feature. Also, the fundamental technology to ensure the security and privacy is the cryptographic technologies. Some of them are quite often used. For example, the cryptographic hash algorithms, the digital signatures, asymmetric key-based encryption, decryption mechanisms, all those things are essential for blockchain smart contract. And beyond that, I think we also mentioned we try to push the computing and storage and the communication to the edge. So edge computing is essential component to enable Web 3.0 for sure. And we have to make those more secure, more efficient. So that's another aspect. And taking one example, we mentioned AI a lot today. And what we are doing right now is mainly relying on those giant servers to help us. But can we do it at the edge? And how do we, well, if we are able to, for example, for the users to train their own local model with their local parameters for data, and then integrate the aggregated model based on the training results from different individual edge devices. And that could be very helpful and also help users protect their data privacy. So I would consider federated learning, for example, could be a promising technology. So that's just my personal view.
Excellent, excellent. Now, that's a very comprehensive view, I got to say. I think, Miko agrees, as he was he's like you watch ventriloquists and they throw their voice and the mouth is not moving. I was very impressed, right? Miko's looking like he's just paying attention, looking at that, and then there's words coming out on the side. Very impressive, Miko. It's a skill I wish I had. Anyhow, so but I think but you've covered a lot, right? You talked about sort of decentralized computing, storage at the edge. So there's decentralized computing, decentralized trust, right? Decentralized contracts and everything out in the open, the ability to validate that. And if you have those capabilities, then you can build essentially a distributed economy, as it were, right? In some sense, without necessarily the need for centralized elements. So what we'll talk about, we'll get into many of these things around, is the Wild West, as Mika was saying, right? So, but before we get into the Wild West, maybe let's talk about who participates in the Wild West, right? Who are the players, right? Who are the sheriffs? Who are the gunslingers? Who are the bad guys or good? I don't know, whatever, right? Who rides into town? So Dan, who are these ecosystem participants in this Wild West? Who's going to ride into town with Web 3.0? What roles will they play, right? And then maybe we'll then next explore the economic models, because at the end of the day, most people want to make money, right? And so they only get interested when, there's some money involved or social good, potentially, different incentives. But let's start with who's riding the town, Dan, in Web 3.0.
So everything that Yu-Hong and Miko talked about is really the highest level of what I consider sort of a multi-layer, not exactly an architecture, it's not totally architected, but a system, which is both a technical system and an economic system. And we can talk about that in a few minutes. And it's all great that someone is going to have, these cool applications and marketplaces and all this stuff, but it's got to run on something somewhere. And, my contention is that just because something is decentralized doesn't mean that it is not run by a big company. So in order to access these services, you have to have, they run on computers somewhere. And where are these computers? Well, Yu-Hong mentioned big servers. Where are they? They're in big data centers. Is that changing? It is. It's more as it going to the edge for low latency services. So there are edge data centers or mini data centers. Some are even on customer premises where you're talking about enterprises, but most of that is moving into the cloud. So we have the central cloud and the distributed cloud. But who owns that computing equipment? In the central cloud, it's the big cloud providers and some other big companies. When it goes to the edge, who owns it? Who owns it and controls it there? It's mostly the same companies. Now, in the telco industry, we have all of this dynamics, I should say, I'll be kind, between the hyperscalers and the telcos. Telcos have the real estate, they have the central offices, they have the last mile, which is expensive to operate, and they have a lot of customer relationships. But it's the hyperscalers that are number one, building more of the wide area networks to connect the telco data centers. AT&T just offloaded that to Microsoft. And they're putting their own edge stacks, computing there. Some of the telcos have tried to do that, not so successful. And then we have sort of the application companies, like Netflix and Apple and Facebook doing some of the same things. And then, of course, you have to have the network access. You have to have accounts, whether it's mobile or fixed account, to get to it. And you don't have much control over the pricing of that. There is competition and there is technical advance, but I don't know many people that are actually ever satisfied with what they get for what they pay. unless you're in Europe, say. The bottom of the pyramid is the consumer. The consumer can be trusted to give away all of their information for free because they do it all the time for convenience. They don't care. The reason you can get all this stuff off the dark web, as Miko said, is because people are careless and they don't want to go through the trouble, or they really don't know. And one of my fears about Web 3.0 is that this will be yet another vehicle to separate the ignorant from their money. And we've already shown that we're really good at doing that. Whether that happens now in the future, I don't really know. But when you look at having something that nobody controls, a lot of it is true that nobody might control sort of a banking system when you have this peer-to-peer sort of negotiation of records. I think it remains to be seen how long that will proliferate before there is some control. Look at the number of countries that are trying to set up their own digital currency. The countries, and they don't want to let these others go rampant. And I'm sure we'll get into, cryptocurrency at some point. But do you know how many cryptocurrencies exist? It's the last number I heard, which is this week, was 11,000. So you want to set up your own? Go ahead. Good luck with that.
I have Dancoin, by the way. So
Dancoin is the best.
I have
one.
Dancoin.
You should all invest in Dancoin. As soon as you do, I will sell everything I own.
Yeah.
What I think what is key to this whole thing is to answer the question, where is there intrinsic value in all of this that warrants investment and warrants expenditure and warrants cycles of mental time? And I used to think that intrinsic value meant something sort of real that you could touch. Well, that all went away with Farmville. Buy these things. They're just, they're in the game. But a lot of life is experiential. And it's always been, whether from reading or telling stories, you're experiencing some pleasure or enjoyment or revelation, without actually doing something yourself, the experience. So I think this will accelerate. And as we've learned from COVID, we can experience a lot more without actually having to go and do something. And I think there will be a hunger for more of that. So if Web 3.0 can bring us more valuable personal experiences through this complicated infrastructure, then I think it will have a chance to succeed. But I think there will be a lot of collateral damage on the side.
Yep. So excellent. Thank you. So it seems like all the old sheriffs are running the town anyway, right? So your hyperscalers, your carriers, everyone, it's in there. Countries, governments, banks are all going to be all one part of Web 3.0. I don't think that changes. But then it allows us to maybe rethink, and the new technologies, the new networks allow us to potentially rethink the way that value is transferred. Well, number one, value is created, value is transferred, right? I think that there are some changes there. So maybe Miko, what kind of economic models do we expect? The same old, or a little different?
I think one of the things that's very fascinating that I think both speakers have pointed out, right, is, Yuhang spoke a little bit about kind of the role of cryptography, and Dan was really talking about sort of this idea of this potential that the ignorant can be separated from their money, right? So in a sense, the thing that I think people need to understand is that this infrastructure is by its nature hyper adversarial, in the sense that the infrastructure handles hyper adversarial use cases, right? So what I mean is that, like, it's actually known that we have cryptographic adversaries in the network, right? Because they're stealing data, they're stealing everything, right? So, the point is that when you look at infrastructure from that lens, right, one of the things that happens is that you have the idea that the infrastructure can be trusted, right? But the issue becomes, should the infrastructure be trusted, right? And so the thing that I think is super complex about this Wild West is that, like, Andre Kranya, who's a pretty famous creator of YFI DeFi ecosystem, basically said that DeFi is money flowing from people who don't know towards people who know. Right. And that's a pretty awful thing to say, in my opinion. Right. And it's awful to say because if someone hacks you, then they're the one who knows, right? Or someone rug pulls you or scams you, they're the one who knows, right? So it covers all the cases, right? Now, obviously, there's some cases where someone is more clever than someone else and they're able to get alpha, right? But I would say that, like, you know, to me, like, it's definitely the right tone to try to understand that the goal is to build trusted infrastructure, right? And the way you do it is through open source, and the way you do it is really that this infrastructure is what enables consent. And what I mean by that is that if someone hacks you, right, then you didn't consent and you got hosed, right? So the thing that this infrastructure is designed to solve, it's designed to solve a case where you don't have a trusted intermediary, so you need to trust the infrastructure. But the thing it does not solve is it hasn't solved the counterparty trust. Right? So if the other person is defrauding you, you can't blame Bitcoin, right? Like, you know, so to me, like, you know, one of the reasons why Bitcoin has been so powerful as a consensus reality is that Bitcoin hasn't failed people. People have failed themselves using Bitcoin pretty badly, you know, but Bitcoin didn't fail them according to the rules of Bitcoin, right? So, you know, so I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why it's gaining so much momentum, because it's a rule-based system that so far has behaved according to its rules.
Correct. And those rules allow disputed transactions, anonymous transactions, you know, open transactions, validated transactions, verified transactions, and you are correct. It has fulfilled the promise of Satoshi Nakamoto, right? And it hasn't been broken, right? But having said that, then just like all mechanisms, right? It's a mechanism, right? And it fulfills what its promise is, right? And so in terms of what we see on Web3, right? It has allowed for potentially new economic models like OpenSea and NFTs, right? And that is in some ways different and yet not, right? And in a sense that, you know, you could auction art before, it's not different, right? What we view as having intrinsic value may be different, as Dan was pointing out, but whether you had Bitcoin or not, whether you had, you know, decentralized DeFi or not, you could still bid on a piece of a GIF or GIF, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Not, you know, right? You could still bid on it. You could still pretend to hold the rights to it. It's just that now there's a different mechanism for doing it, a more distributed mechanism for doing it than before, right? So, in that sense, has Web3 actually changed the economic models? Do you see that? I don't know, Miko, Dan.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So, like, there isn't a fundamental change to the economic model. I think the model is the same, which is that, and I think it comes back to what Dan said, right? Which is that that there needs to be value creation, right?
Yes.
You know, but to me, the question has more to do also with value capture, which is why I think this is so disruptive, right? Which is that, in a sense, if you think about value creation and value capture, right, one of the things that becomes so interesting is the distribution of incentives, including things like ownership, right? So what I mean by ownership distribution, right, is that the early participants in a protocol often get tokens that represent ownership of that protocol, right? And the ownership represents basically future cash flows, right? So if there are future cash flows associated with the operating of a network, and the network sufficiently taxes users, right, then those distributions can then be yielded to the owners, right? And that the network effect associated with that growth of that network can be fairly distributed to early users and late users alike, right? Obviously, the early users get most of the benefit, right? A proportional to their creation, their participation in the early network effect, which is the most important. So, you know, so I would say that's what makes this extremely disruptive, right? Which is that, would you rather use a network that gives you ownership that's tied to future cash flows, or would you use one that does exactly the same thing but doesn't do that? right?
Right.
So that's
I think that's fair.
That's a big
that's
issue.
fair. Although the way you describe it sounds like a Ponzi scheme too, right? In some sense, it mirrors the setup of a Ponzi scheme.
But
right?
the part that
Or pyramid scheme, right?
the part that's non-Ponzi comes straight back to what Dan said, which is the creation of value. And
That's
so
correct.
when I
Yes.
talk about taxation, right, what I'm really saying about taxation, so for example, take a protocol like IPFS, the interplanetary file
Yep.
system, right?
Yep.
So the
Yep.
thing that happens with a protocol like that, or even a system like Ethereum, right? In order to store, so if you look at something like Filecoin, Filecoin actually has now an incentivization layer over IPFS. So if you store, you
Yep.
get
You get paid, yeah.
So what happens is people who are storing things on Filecoin are now paying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the network is now levying taxes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability of the network to levy taxes is the ability for them to distribute a service that people want to use, right?
Correct.
And the want is represented by their payment, right? And so their payment is tied to the distribution of future cash flows, right? So if you have, so what I'm saying is those aren't new economics whatsoever, right? And it ties
Correct.
totally back to what Dan said, right? Which is
Correct.
if you're delivering value, then you have the ability to use old economics. And the old economics are that ownership of things that create value can be tied to cash flows, right? And those cash flows can then provide economic benefit for the users, right? So that's all we're saying.
Yeah, no, and that's true, right? If you own a network, a payment, effectively a payment network like Visa or Amex, right? You own the ability to make money off the network as people buy into the network. And your job in owning the network is to build the trust and efficiency, of the network. And so you are incentivized to do that. Likewise, what DeFi gives you essentially is a way to set up incentives in a more distributed format with lower, I would say, lower barriers to entry, if it, as it were, as long as you get people to buy into it. And you can distribute incentives and pay for services that people provide in a more granular way, in a more distributed way, in a much more efficient way than we do have today. So I think from those elements, I see the value in that.
Yeah, I mean, if you come back to Ethereum, as Johan pointed out, right?
Yes.
Like, in order to use the compute service of Ethereum, you need to pay this gas, right? And
Exactly.
so what's happening is that the Ethereum network is actually able to flow cash, right, into, so what's happening is that these so-called miners are actually getting paid, in order to perform the computations,
Correct.
right? So that value generation can be distributed by the network, in a kind of a process, right?
Yeah.
So
No, I think that's fair, right? I mean, yeah, that's correct. I mean, one of the most brilliant setups there was essentially the incentives, right, to actually do the work to keep the network up, essentially distribute that to other people and get paid. I mean, the only downside was you end up generating more CO2, blah, 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 blah. But that's we'll have to deal with that, and we've learned, right, proof of work, proof of stake. There's different ways of doing it, right? So we're getting smarter now as we raise global temperatures, but hopefully we'll be in time. But regardless, separate conversation. Anyway, so Web 3.0, what are the barriers to its success? What do we think? I mean, so it seems like there's a new Wild West, new protocols, maybe same economic models, but now faster, better, more scalable. Dan, any thoughts around what might slow down or stop Web3, as amorphous as it is, from being successful?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at the infrastructure, and we have to look outside the US and maybe outside the developed world. And you can certainly call this a success without the participation of the developing world, but I think it'll be a missed opportunity to do so. And I think it's very hard to take it there until you have a better build out of the infrastructure. If you look what the Telecom Infra Project is doing, trying to lower the cost of infrastructure in the developing world. I mean, the goal is to get more eyeballs on Facebook, but it's got a lot of other advantages, I should say, as well. So I think one of the obstacles will simply be that of getting the right infrastructure, getting the right computing power where it belongs, and the right access if it depends on low latency. And right now, if that's going to be 5G, that's an industrial application right now. It's not consumer. So I think there's that element. Then I think probably the biggest obstacle is public trust. As you know, as everyone has pointed out, Miko pointed out, and people have already lost fortunes in these new technologies, and more fortunes will
And
be
made
lost.
fortunes too. It's the other side too, right?
Some have, and that's what encourages everybody. It's always a few that do and a whole lot that do not.
Right.
And this whole proposition that we're going to be, we don't have big governments involved, we have nobody in charge, this remains to be proven. And I think until we have more proof points and more evidence of value and validity, I think it'll be fits and starts and sort of a small risk-prone group participating.
Yep.
Just off the top.
No, I think that's fair. But here's the thing. I mean, governments are always very smart, right? If it's making money, they'll be there too, right? We know that. They're smart that way. That's why they call government. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You Hong, any thoughts around any other barriers that you see to Web3 success?
Yes, I basically echo Dan's point. I think he mentioned that as public trust. So from my point of view, I may say that as a security. So yes, if the Bitcoin or the blockchain that's considered is not secure enough, so although you may kind of gain a lot, seems to be a lot, but suddenly you may lose them all as well. So security is very important. I think that's the essential component there. And beyond that, I think another issue is, as Dan previously also mentioned, there are like 11,000 different digital currencies now, right? Mm-hmm. And then I can imagine they were created for different purposes, maybe different applications. Mm-hmm. But eventually, if we want to build like an infrastructure, right? How can we increase the interoperability? That's another challenging issue. Otherwise, it's still kind of isolated, focusing on a narrow domain, right?
Yeah. We need one coin to rule them all, right? Yeah.
Yes. So how do we enable that? Of course, people consider, like they follow different protocols. Their consensus mechanism could be very different. Their data formats are also very different. So this is a really challenging issue. And there are some techniques that are developed to facilitate such transmission. But again, the efficiency, how fast can you do that? Well, at the same time, ensuring the security. You don't, for example, if there is a blockchain system that is not secure and someone can compromise that, but once this blockchain is linked with other blockchain systems, guess what? The pollutions can go.
Yeah, no, I agree with Miko. If I can find that, I'd be golden. Yep.
Yeah. So maybe Miko can point out something else as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're articulating is very astute, which is something that Vitalik Buterin actually pointed out prior to the Solana wormhole hack, right? Which is the bridge that allows Ethereum to be wrapped on the Solana blockchain, right? So what we're talking about is we're talking about how you have two different consensus blockchains, right? Solana and Ethereum, right? And the question is, how do assets move from one chain to the other chain, right? And, I think what, Professor Liu pointed out is that, like, in a sense, it's about the weakest link, right? Yeah. So if you can penetrate, so the hacker made off with, I think, something like $300 million worth of Ethereum, so it really is a, very apocalyptic hack, so I would say that, like, cybersecurity is absolutely critically important, but I think the other thing that becomes critically important, and I think it is, I think, to highlight what Dan was concerned about, like, it is concerning this idea about wealth inequality and distribution, right? Because, in essence, like, this kind of super Wild West scenario, it really then becomes kind of an opportunity for, predatory behavior, and I think that is concerning. I think there are kind of interesting developments that relate to kind of open source, right? And open source has a quality of kind of removing economic externalities, right? Because it feeds on these externalities as a source of energy, right? So what do I mean when I say that, right? Which is, if someone is not content with the way things are, then that's a user, right? So anyone who's not content can be a user, and the software that serves the largest number of discontented users becomes the dominant software. Right. So in a sense, like open source has a wonderful property because open source is really only driven by consent, right? In the sense that, like, it's not, open source historically hasn't been driven by money. I think, one of the complicated things that has happened is that, open source projects have started printing their own money. So, so now there's the financial incentive.
Correct.
And I think the stakes of this entire game is open source going to kind of purify money, or is money going to ruin open source?
I think the latter, as we've learned, right? I mean, again, but I'd love to hear from the panel, right? Because generally speaking, the origins of open source were relatively pure. There was, and over time, generally speaking, other players come in, the incentives are a little different from the original, and so what we've seen is, I mean, regardless of DeFi, regardless of Web 3.0, right? That when there's a quick way to make money, or if the incentive is monetary first and social good second, then there's usually a challenge, or social good third or fourth or fifth or sixth, right? And so it also changes, I would say, the nature of maybe not the world order, right? But it also puts power in the hands of those who can code and those who understand cryptography, right? Which is, I think, important. I think that's one takeaway. Is I'm going to go back and start, shouting at my kids to quickly learn cryptography,
study their algebra.
Very important, Dan. Very important.
Algebra.
Very. Yeah, exactly. So, sorry, I think you're going to say something as well. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think, you mentioned one important point, that is education. I think we try to educate.
We agree. Yep.
The general public.
That's right.
Go ahead, Yuhong. Sorry.
Sorry, I mean, there are actually many YouTubers. They are generating different types of short videos just online available, and then that could help. I think that's very intuitive and easy to understand.
Excellent. I should watch some of those too. So, so Dan, go ahead.
So one of my concerns about this whole movement, as it were, is whether it can help us avoid what in so many other cases is a winner-take-most market. Mm-hmm. Could we really have not just decentralized distributed finance and control, but distributed victory in the market, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sort of shared success.
Yeah.
We all want, you mentioned one currency. We sort of like to have one thing we can count, and then everybody has interoperability with it. But that comes at a steep price, which is somebody makes all the money and controls the pace of innovation. Mm-hmm. And I'm against both of those things. So if we can have enough in common that everybody needs and will agree on, and that's, I think, where open source is helpful. Let's do that for components that we don't have to replicate. Let's agree on that, and then let's put our resources to innovate around it. Mm-hmm. If we can have enough infrastructure, enough common practices in place, so that we really can innovate on the applications that will make Web 3.0 successful or not, then I think that's the outcome I would certainly like to see personally.
Yeah, that'd be great to verify. The social good contract inherent in a coin, right? That if you rewarded for be rewarded for random acts of kindness. How's that? Anyway, but yeah, before we move on to maybe some of the recommendations, and audience, please go ahead and feel free to ask your questions. And I know that Miko's been the other part of Miko's been answering these questions on the side. I think it's like got split personality. It's one that's typing and the one that's talking, and they're visible to us. Anyway, but feel free to ask questions. I'd like to say, what early signs, given that Miko's put money into this, Miko, what early signs are we seeing of Web 3.0's uptake? Right, we talked a bit about the barriers to success. What signs are promising around Web 3?
Yeah, so to me, like one of the things that is really, I think important is that when we think about this as a Wild West, right? Like eventually, like rails were built, and eventually towns were built, and eventually kind of laws were established, right? So, I think these things are coming. Like I think that we are seeing kind of more regulatory purview, I think so. In a sense, like I think the Wild West may become less wild and to its own benefit, right? So I think those are beneficial things. I think to me, as far as kind of adoption patterns, one of the really interesting adoption patterns that I've been seeing is the domain of play to earn gaming. Right. And it's been very interesting being an investor in Yield Guild Games, or YGG, because they have created sort of a mechanism. They're in the Philippines, and they created a mechanism where they have these concept of scholars, right? And they're providing these things called scholarships, right? And what happens is that they're basically lending game assets to players who don't really have much economic means, but the players can then use the game assets to earn cryptographic assets, and what's kind of fascinating about what's happening there is, we're actually seeing kind of a on-ramp, right? So what's happening is that those people are learning kind of a lot about how to do crypto things, and then they're eventually kind of becoming investors, so it's a fascinating phenomenon, and for me, it's been a really interesting thing to be close to.
Yeah, no, that's definitely very interesting, and I think I've seen in Dan and my world on the networking side, we've also seen a couple of networks, Helium and Poland, that actually provide they provide incentives for people to put up 5G infrastructure, 4G, 5G infrastructure to connect people and get paid for the traffic that goes over those networks. So it's inherently creating a network, if you will, or a parallel mobile network, and with an incentive structure to put up, more of those base stations and get paid for carrying traffic, openly on your infrastructure. And so I think, that kind of model could work in developing countries as well, right? The incentives so that if you're a store owner or you own a school or whatever it is, or church, you could put up a structure. And now you have, DeFi, the ability to put up the structure and get paid for the structure and the traffic that goes over it. So I think there is a communication, social good, DeFi element and 5G networking all combined, right? So those are some of the ones that I've seen as well, which make it really, really interesting. So let's see. We have a couple of other questions that maybe we'll like to take before I wrap up with our recommendations to the audience. I think there's one that says here between the goals between Web3 and traditional distributed web folks, and I don't know. I think Mika, you've had some conversations in parallel on it. But
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm happy to respond. I mean, if you think about distributed web, right, it's something that's been around for quite a while, and the focus of distributed web has really been kind of on things like distributed computing,
Right.
And I think the biggest difference is that if you look at it, if you look at the Web3 crowd is actually dealing with a problem of trust, right? And so that's the real substrate, right? So the thing that I think is unfortunate is that we're headed towards a planet that has 8 billion humans on it, right? So in a sense, one of the things that has happened is that, institutional trust hasn't really been tested at these scales before, right? So when there are cataclysmic failures of institutional trust, right, people begin to start to kind of question institutions, right? Now, the thing that's really complex is, whether we can trust technology, and whether
Right.
we can trust these new infrastructures that will, and whether we can kind of like learn how to interact with such systems, in a way that is inclusive and is beneficial to everyone and creates value, and the thing that I think is super complicated is how innovation is tied in with lots of kind of bad actors, right? But I think,
Right.
to me, the thing that I think is important to understand is that it isn't the infrastructure handles adversarial use cases because the world is provably adversarial, right? So in a sense, like you can't blame someone got angry because the the design of Bitcoin is hyper adversarial, and to me it's kind of like, and the world is also can be occasionally hyper adversarial. So as infrastructure, it needs to handle those edge cases. That's just my feeling.
Yep. No, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair point. So we're coming to the end of this, and what I'd like to do is, I guess, welcome to ask questions, audience, and we'll get to those as well if those come in. But in the meantime, what I'd like to ask, I think, for me, when I attend a webinar, I usually enjoy the discussion and everything's great, and then at the end, sometimes I forget what it's all about, and I walk away. I'm like, so what did I learn, or what are the key lessons or takeaways I should have walked away from? And so I find that it's helpful for me, at least as a moderator, if I can get a panel to provide us with key takeaways at the end, because the last 5 minutes I usually remember, at least. And so maybe a couple of thoughts around what's sort of the key takeaways, and the other thing too is what should I do, or what should I tell my kids to get ready for Web3? So I'll start with you, Hong.
Yeah, thanks. So there are a lot of things that I think are important, but to summarize, I think I also want to emphasize security. So we all know by the early stage of the internet, people consider a lot about the functionality, the performance, but they didn't consider security that much. And that caused a lot of issues fundamentally. And we actually have spent a lot of efforts trying to fix them, but so I think the blockchain technologies for Web 3.0, I think we have a lot of discussion today regarding the security aspects. So I'm very glad to see that actually. So hopefully, even if we cannot provide like perfect security, but it's very good that people start to have this question in mind and keep this in their adventure exploring experiences with Web 3.0. So I think that's very nice. And another thing is also I want to say like education point of view.
Yep.
So yeah, how do we, it seems like there are so many fancy technologies. Where should I start, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So one thing I did my study by learning some online YouTube videos. I think they provide very nice explanations. They have those, very nice demos, animations. And I also plan to, integrate some of those in my teaching classes as well. So I would say this may be a good starting point, especially for kids. My 7-year-old boy, he watches YouTube every day, and he learns a lot of knowledge from that.
Yeah, no, I'm very impressed at how much YouTube has. I mean, there's a lot of rubbish on it too, but
Right.
but I'm very impressed at some of the quality of the videos and the quality of the explanations. I wish I had access to those when I was going to school. I mean, they explain better than some of the professors, right? So, not not
Thank
Professor
you.
Liu, but other professors. I'm talking about other professors, right? So, all right. Next up, Dan. So, sort of key takeaways, key thoughts. How should we prep for Web3?
Well, I am encouraged that Miko has found good companies to invest in that will do good things with this. I think it's going to be probably 5 years before this becomes kind of a pervasive part of our everyday lives. And in the meantime, there will be some fantastic wealth made and a lot of casualties.
Yeah.
And so what I tell my kids is watch your wallet.
Yep. Now, I think that's very fair. That's doesn't matter what the technology is, doesn't matter what innovation is. That's going to be people who make money and it's people who lose money. And if you lose money and lose it in the right way, that's okay, but don't get scammed, right? I think that's very fair. So, let's see, Miko, your thoughts, key takeaways, and then also I think someone wants you to elaborate on the advertising goes away and it goes straight to the users. So
Yeah. So the advertising internet is actually kind of provably toxic, right? So in a way, like Zuck said, I don't want to run a company called Facebook anymore, so he changed the name of the company, right? And Jack Dorsey is like, I don't want to run a company called Twitter anymore. I want to run a company called Block, right? So he changed Square to Block, right? So like, so that's the amazing oh yeah, bye.
But yeah, Yu Hong had to leave. Sorry, she has a class.
Yeah,
She has
yeah,
to
yeah.
educate the next generation.
That's it. She's building
she's-
Web3 and
She is.
cryptography.
She is. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Sorry
so
about
kind
that.
of so my final upshot here is Web 2 is basically a bunch of like marketers in white coats being like, what are they going to do? How can we make them do stuff, right? And Web 3 is just a person sitting in their sweats at home being like, what do I want to do? And the reason why I say that is that the dollars will flow to the users as a form of incentive, right? So it's basically like, come here and participate in the creation of the early network effect of our service, right? And here's the incentive or reward, right? So it's a lot less of this kind of idea of like, how do we convince people to come to this thing? It's more like, if it's a good thing, people will come. Right. Like, so,
Yep.
so that's a big thing, and I think, I think Dan's absolutely right. We're still quite early. And I think the quality of the good things to enjoy it's pretty limited, but I think the quality of the good things to enjoy will definitely improve. I mean, I think we're seeing an incredibly large wall of venture capital. Andreessen Horowitz is raising a $4.5 billion crypto dedicated fund. FTX announced a $2 billion fund. Paradigm has a $2 billion fund, right? So like, the quality software will come.
Yep.
I can assure you, there will be good experiences to be had by, fairly normal humans. So, right now it's kind of weird, creepy crypto land full of like, strange people. But, I think it'll be filled with pretty normal people in due course.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, as these things mature, then governments, institutions, everyone comes in, right? The banks will come in, not, maybe not all initially, but they will all come in. And I think, it's interesting, a lot of the first phase of internet built on communications technologies, and now there's a layer of cryptography capabilities, right? That help engender and recreate trust, right? So this is TLS version X, whatever, right? I mean, the next level up. And I think the inherent in that is a lot of intelligence, a lot of ability to sort of program, new elements in there, right? It's sort of a software-defined trust layer that you can sort of drive everywhere. And on that, you can build commerce, you can build other kind of distribution and value creation, value capture systems. So definitely very, very interesting in my mind anyhow. So, all right, I think with that, I would like to thank the audience for having been with us. Really enjoyed this conversation. And I would like to turn it over to Yvonne, and thank you for the opportunity, Yvonne.
Thank you so much. I don't know about the rest of our audience, but I learned a ton. And I can now go to my 13-year-old and say, hey, I now know definitely growing up faster and with all this understanding that my generation seems to have more trouble with. Just want to say one more thing. One of my favorite lines of this whole panel discussion was, what do we, when are we trusting, or how are we putting our trust in Web3 with the new infrastructure and the technologies and the weird crypto, what did you call weird crypto land, Nico? So to that end, thank you everyone. Thanks to our panelists. Really great discussion. If you have any follow-up questions, audience, please reach out to me. I can connect you to any of our panelists. And you have a wonderful day. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.